All right, guys. Hi, hello. What we're doing today is we're going to be talking about Unit 4 add-ons. So most of this stuff is new, though some of it is, again, overlap or just more information than I could give you yesterday. So we're going to go through, again, pay attention, make sure that you're keeping track of things that you're like, whoa, I don't understand that. Or if you're looking for examples or whatever it might be, please be specific, again, with your questions and concerns so that I can help you as best as I can in this virtual time, okay? So with that said and done, we're going to dive right in, all right? So today we're going to talk about the EU. The EU is a big ticket item. This is one of those things that I would probably say would kind of rise up amongst all the concepts that could happen, especially given the state of the EU today. But again, so here we go. We're going to talk about the European Union, which is an alliance, which of course is multiple countries together working with each other. It's supranational, so it's a supranation, and overall. Originally, it was just a trade organization for steel and coal in the post-war time period as Europe was recovering. Eventually, it's going to develop of the EEC, or the European Economic Community, which makes it a little bit bigger, which is going to expand the trade from just coal and steel to all kinds of different materials. By the time we get to 2013, there are 28 members, with others kind of waiting in the wings to become part of it. When we talk about this union, it's more than just trade base. It's not just an economic organization any longer. It is a free trade union, so there are no taxes, no tariffs between the countries that are part of this union. It also allows for open boundaries, so there's no border controls. You can travel freely between the different countries without having to go through all the same steps as you would from one foreign country to another. That began in 1985. They decided to go and move to the same currency. So countries within the EU all use the euro, minus a few. Again, this is something to help with exchange fees, because this is a very complex alliance that they've all created with each other. There is like extra levels of, I guess, just management that have to happen. There is a judicial union, a European Court of Justice, which is the group that weighs in on problems that happen between EU countries. There's also legislative and regulatory bodies, aka like checks and balances, similar to what we have in the United States, where you've got people who rule on issues, who create new laws, who are going to kind of regulate and keep track of things. There's a huge parliament that, again, imposes and approves laws within the EU. There's 751 representatives from all the different countries. The Euro Commission is one rep per state. It's like a second item. They're the ones in charge that can kind of enact and enforce the different regulations. The thing about the EU that makes it such an important thing in political geography is that the decisions that countries make regarding each other, it is that much more complicated, because if you do something with one country in the EU, you're doing it to all of them. They are the largest economy in the world. If you look at it as one super nation, if you look at the individual countries, they're all over the board. Where they fall, again, and the United States would rise above them, but the EU by itself is, again, a super nation. It's this huge organization that allows for those countries to, again, trade with each other. There's less competition and bigger competition worldwide, because they have to try and outdo those places to get those countries within the EU to buy from them. Of course, there complaints, so much so that certain groups in countries have decided to leave the EU. The UK is, of course, that example there. The complaints is that because there are no taxes within. There is a value added tax that happens, a sales tax basically. That there are issues with courts overruling state or local decisions. The open boundaries is tough for some countries, because immigrant populations put a lot of stress onto governments, onto the people themselves, so on and so forth. In order for the EU to operate, they did have to come up with their own constitution or their plan, which tries to kind of explain or describe how the system of governments would become much more official so that individual governments would lose power to the EU, not just economically, but politically. Yeah, it didn't pass for a lot of different reasons. The EU, though, still is a force to be reckoned with on the global scene overall. Some other spatial concepts, again, this idea of kind of understanding where these groups are at and how this is going. So there's territoriality, which is the expression of political control over space. So when you are, again, saying this is ours, you're proclaiming this territory as theirs overall. There's the idea of citizenship, which is your legal identity of a person based on the state where you're born or naturalized. So where you have that official document that states your nationality. There's the idea of expatriate. An expatriate is a citizen of another country living in a foreign state. States with large concentrations of expatriates must provide consular services, again, having some kind of a consulate, which is like a touchstone. It's a sovereign piece of land for the country those people are from, where they can get legal documents and passports and visas and stuff like that. When expatriates are found into a foreign country, when they're trapped by war or disaster, it's up to the home country to get them out. So they have to go to the consulate and get that figured out, so on and so forth. I put enclave and exclave in here. These are slightly different definitions to the ones from yesterday, just to see if maybe these ones hit better. Again, enclave is that minority group within a country, an ethnic neighborhood, pieces of countries that have a higher concentration of a differing group. Exclave is that group outside of. So fragmented piece of sovereign territory separated by land from the main part. Sometimes, again, try to claim land in name of nationalism. Often there's conflict. At times they can get pieces back or things like that. Kaliningrad, Alaska, these are exclaves. That's how you could look at them. Alaska is separated by a whole nother country. So that's an exclave of the United States. Kaliningrad is an exclave of Russia, so on and so forth. Some more detail on the sea. Okay, I know I'm going to get questions about this, I'm sure. So again, the law of the sea, right? The United Nations Committee of the Law of the Sea is what that fancy little acronym is all about. Again, passed first in 82 and again updated in 94. Proposed standard oceanic boundaries for all UN members. This only applies to countries that are part of the UN. Almost every country of the world is part of the UN. And it's about territory in the sea, sovereign territory that includes the area at least 12 nautical miles out. Then you've got the next up to 200 nautical miles, which is just economic control. So not the other laws, things like that, but they do have control of any natural resources, exploration, extraction, and then the high seas outside of 12 nautical miles limit. Admiralty law. And you've ever seen in a movie or a TV show where they're like, we're going to get to international waters. Or if you have ever seen, again, like on a cruise where they talk about how the captain has the power of law on the ship. They can marry people, they can put them in the brig. Again, because in the high seas, they're the ones in charge. There's no country that tells them what to do. There is one exception to the high seas item, and that has to do with hunting of whales. You can't do that. It's not allowed. How is it that the UN handles this? They have a board set aside. It's a specific part of the United Nations that settles disputes regarding the boundaries at sea. Usually what ends up happening is that the dispute just gets drawn a line down the middle and half, make it simple. It struggles though when the areas under dispute are uninhabited, again, above the water. So it's claimed by multiple countries. It takes years to resolve those kinds of issues. They're very complex. A good example of as conflict that had made it all the way to the arbitration board, I mentioned it yesterday, is the South China Sea. The Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands again, they're man-made. So the land around, or the sea around them, now has different claims laid onto it. The reason this is so important and this is such a big deal is that there's oil under the seafloor there. And every country within the vicinity wants that. It's a big part of that. Getting into boundaries a little bit more, some other things, again, kind of I'm just touching on some various different things. Delamination is when borders are put onto a map. Again, I always think of lamination when you put the plastic sheets onto pieces of paper. That's basically what this is. When you delaminate, you're going to be putting the boundaries officially onto a map. Demarcation is just going to be the markers placed in the ground where the borders lie, and those little dots. This is where this ends, and this is where this begins. Boundary disputes. There are different types. There's definitional. Again, when borders treaties, they can get interpreted in different ways. So if you look at, like, again, a treaty from many years ago and you're like, well, I think this means this, and you're like, nope, I think it means that, the definition of that boundary is under dispute. Locational. Where is the boundary? Again, they are not getting along. Again, especially if a border moves, like a natural border, if a river changes course or a lake dries up and it changes the boundary, where does that actually lie then? Operational. This is when borders are agreed to, but the passage across the border becomes a problem. So when the border is set and then there is movement happening, and then the operations day to day become more difficult. Allocational is when a resource lies on two sides of a border. Who gets what? Who's going to allocate what to what? So on and so forth. Okay. Most boundary disputes in this day and age are based off of post-colonial issues, as I've talked about before, and how it gets me all riled up. The Conference of Berlin in 1888 is the meeting where the European powers took the map of Africa and they're like, yeah, this is where this is going to go, and this is where this is going to go. And they totally ignored all of the boundaries that already existed between groups. The interior became a mess. It's just got really bad, obviously, after the 20th century. It was more and more of those countries were given independence, and then they had to figure out where the boundaries lie, if they're going to keep them, if they're not, and who's in charge. Self-determination, that deciding for themselves, becomes again a huge point of contention with lots of different groups across the African continent. This phrase, tyranny of the map. Tyranny is to force your way into control. That's exactly what superimposed boundaries are, when they don't match with the cultural boundaries and leading to issues. Again, it's just another way of talking about this same post-colonial conflict that is, again, totally outside of their control. Rwanda is a good example. Again, the issues with the Hutu and the Tutsi, again, after independence is found, and then the fight that goes down because they're forced to live together. Getting into some other stuff, again, thinking electoral politics, we obviously spent a lot of time talking about gerrymandering, these internal boundaries overall, some things that might come up as far as wording that you might want to have access to is suffrage, the right to vote. Again, it's a word that you probably associate with women's suffrage of the early 1900s in America. Again, women were fighting for the right to vote. Suffrage is a word just by itself that means the right to vote. Popular representation in all democracies, they have some sort of parliamentary system, again, at least one lawmaking body that you elect people to be part of. And of course, that again, in order for that to be fair, they need to come up with districts. Each country has its own system regarding the number of seats and the size of the district. That's where gerrymandering comes into play. How people have manipulated our voting districts to always turn out one way versus another. The Electoral College, this is something poli-sci that is like very unique to the United States, and it's also very complicated. You'll learn more about it in junior year, to be very honest. If they talk about the Electoral College, it'd probably be with a map. So they'd give you reference points with that. The electoral itself is how the United States president actually gets decided. It's not the popular vote doesn't guarantee someone will win. Electoral votes are based off of within the country or within each state, and the popular vote in each district, and then how that goes with electoral. Again, it's an intense thing. The most electoral votes is winner take all, so not Maine and New Nevada, they don't, again, have that process. Yep. Number is based on total numbers of representative seats plus 2 senators. So like DC has 3 votes. They've got 2 senators and 1 representative just because they're so small. So that's how many electoral votes they get is 3. Reappropriation. That's the fancy word for saying redrawing the boundaries. Based off of the census, it changes, again, the number of seats that a district might get or a state might get. It affects the electoral votes too. Again, they try and make them equal for voting purposes, but we know that gerrymandering makes it unfair still in a lot of situations. Okay. So this is, again, more very dense poli-sci stuff that, again, the textbook doesn't do a great job of talking about. So again, I'm going to just get into it with you guys. You're going to want to know these in a basic way. And I'd be shocked if they ask you about this, but again, you never know. So we're going to talk about different types of political economies. And again, politics and economy, they're all mixed up. There's very few places in the world where politics and economy are separate. Again, no places in the world that are like that. Throughout history, this got all mixed up together, of course, to see different forms and different, again, ways to do this. One is feudalism. Feudalism is a social, political, and economic system that's got a very set sort of breakdown of who's got power and who's got the wealth and who's got, again, influence. There's an aristocracy involved. The wealthy landowners, they are the lords and the marquis and the barons, the dukes and the princesses, things like that. And then there is the peasants, commoners, serfs, slaves, poor laborers. They pay rent, pay in their harvest, they get taxed. Again, debt peonage comes into play here, where if you can't pay your taxes or you can't pay your, again, rent, you're going to be forced to be a slave to work off that debt. This feudalism is where absolute monarchy takes place. Absolute monarchy is there is someone in charge, king, a prince, a duke. They're both the head of the government as well as the head of everything because they don't share their power with anyone. It's absolute, one person. Some modern day examples, we've got Saudi Arabia, Brunei, Morocco, the UAE. A lot of times, absolute monarchy ends with revolution and war because people want to have a say in their government, but that doesn't mean every place has, obviously, since there's still some absolute monarchies that exist today. Another one is constitutional monarchy. Constitutional monarchy is where there is a supreme aristocrat who remains head of the state, but they don't have the same powers. There is also an elected element, elected parliament, again, and they really make the decisions. They usually have some kind of prime minister, premier, somebody who has more power than the actual king or queen. They appoint senior members of parliament to be ministers, secretaries, kind of create an executive branch like the United States. Perfect example of this is the UK. They have a constitutional monarchy and have for quite a while, long time. Another one is the idea of Commonwealth of Nations. Again, this is going to be an alliance based off of former parts of the British Empire. Most, not all, retain the British monarch as their head of state. So Canada still recognizes the Queen of England as their queen, but they have their own parliaments, the prime ministers, Jason Trudeau. No, yeah, that's right. Ooh, now I'm going to... Trudeau's last is definitely his last name. I don't know. Now I can't remember his first name. That's okay. And then they have like a governor general as a crown representative. They have a minor political link to the UK. Mostly it's military support that happens. Their militaries are still kind of working together. Free market democracy. This is, again, where we're going to see generally elected individuals are going to represent the government. It's like a commonwealth of countries, other constitutional monarchies, republics. It's internal to a state. So it generally relies upon balancing relationship between the government, its citizens, and its business interests. There is regulation and taxation by the state, but most people get to decide what they want to do and how they spend their money. Republic is free of monarchs, free of, again, wealthy landowners. It's fully under the control of the common people. There is separation of power. There's different branches, checks and balances. The Constitution needs to be written. There's usually flexibility because there's no perfect government that exists out there. Political influence, who actually controls the government decisions, are usually the wealthy. But of course, it's supposed to be everybody. Okay, let's talk about Marxism, socialism, communism, all of this jazz. Okay, so communism, good in theory, bad in practice. That's the best way to describe this. So communism is where the state, the government, owns all the land and industry, and they are going to be responsible for all economic productivity. They pay everyone exactly the same. They tell everybody what they're supposed to do, when they're supposed to do it, what they get to have. It kind of rights the wrongs of feudalism by trying to create equality, and tries to get away from capitalism, free market. As I've said in the past, as I said above, good in theory, bad in practice. Most countries that have tried out communism, this doesn't end up happening. There is inequality. There is issues with getting everyone the same. Marxism, socialism, it goes beyond politics and government, or politics and economics. It's also social. So this is total classless society, no inequality in terms of wealth and power. Everyone is the same. In order for any of this to work, there needs to be a lot of planning that goes into the economy. Having a planned economy, it's a key to a working communist state, and it does not rely on supply and demand. The government needs to calculate the needs of their people, and then they set quotas for each individual to produce so that those needs get met. This would result in a collective wealth that would be equally shared across the population. The USSR, of course, is the most famous attempt to use communist ideas and to overhaul their country. Joseph Stalin, the leader of the USSR initially, sets up 5-year plans to try and, again, plan this out, make it work. Industrial quotas to ensure economic growth. Unfortunately, the idea of a classless society gets thrown out pretty fast. You've got like the Communist Party, which is the ruling class, and then you've got the military officers, or the, again, army, which is the second class, and then you've got everybody else. A issue in the USSR why, again, in practice it's a good idea, but in theory it's a good idea, but practice it didn't work. Not a lot of incentive to actually get people to do this. Because of that, it kind of led to a lack of surplus where the wealth would come in, where everyone would get risen up by having that collective wealth. Kind of the last thing that we're going to talk about as far as add-ons is geopolitics. This is just a fancy way of talking about global relationships between different countries, different states. When we're looking at geopolitics, something that kind of plays a role here is the centrifugal forces that we've talked about yesterday. This is just, again, trying to showcase this, factors that hold together the social or political fabric of a state. Again, pedal to, fly away, as I said. Nationalism, strong leader, good economy, centrifugal. This can apply to not just to singular states, but to whole groups in areas. If there becomes too many outside forces that push them apart, that's where things, again, they fall into pieces. One of the big areas that, again, you'll definitely want to have kind of in your back pocket is talking about Yugoslavia. It's the Balkans. Okay, so Yugoslavia is a perfect example of Balkanization, and again, the idea of balkanize, because this one country, which was created after World War I, forced a bunch of different ethnic and religious groups to live within the same boundaries. And then after World War II, the country itself flourished. It did really well. It had a strong leader. It had good economy. It had all these centripetal forces keeping these different groups together under Joseph Tito. And then after Tito's death in 1980, a political vacuum opened up, and all of these different groups came through, and it ripped the country apart. And it became, again, it was balkanization. It broke down into groups. They could not stay together. They went through the process of balkanization. And now today you would refer to this area as balkanized, with all of these different groups fighting and with each other for their control and sovereignty. It's a lot. All of this is a lot. Again, so moving on from here, Things work to be completed today. By 1 p.m., you should have looked through all of your Unit 4 materials, looked through the different things that I posted, and then post your questions and concerns. Try and be specific. We're going to move on to Unit 5 starting tomorrow and then Thursday, which is our agriculture unit. So looking at those various things and getting another post to classroom. And then a meet on that day. There will be an interactive review. I'm going to change it up. I'm thinking the challenge thing didn't quite work the way I wanted it to this last time, so we'll see how that goes. More information at the end of the week. By Monday, at the latest, it's already posted, so you could already have got this done, is to post Unit 5 for tips and tricks. Again, things to help people remember items over the weekend. Because you have 1 week from today before this exam takes place, you should just focus on the big things, the things that are really, again, sticking out to you as being difficult. Reach out to me with questions. You should do a little bit of map review, kind of work it into your shortlist studying. Again, get a look at some maps, make sure that you have access to that. Please make sure you're checking Classroom if you are taking the exam on May 12th. Again, because there are things getting posted, things that you should be doing, trying out before, again, the exam day, because otherwise you're going to be scrambling and no one's going to be able to help you because I can't talk to you on the day. I know that says 8 days. It's only 7 days. I'm going to change it. Don't worry. But we got a week. I hope you guys have a good day. I will see you all later.